Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here with us today as we hear from our experts in the field of worker and human well-being and the future of work. I'm Marla Wilson, Vice President of Development and Partnerships here at New America, and I'm excited that you have joined us for this very important discussion. Many of you are joining us for the first time and may be wondering who we are and what we actually do here at New America. I'm delighted to share with our newcomers and reiterate for our returning guests. In short, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focused on solutions that can have immediate and long-lasting impact on the lives of all Americans. Our mission is to generate ideas that maximize access, opportunity, and security for all. So over the next hour, we certainly want this to be an interactive discussion. So please use the chat to ask questions, and I'll be sure to tap into those throughout the conversation. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Bridget Schultz. Bridget is the director of Better Life Lab, which is the work family justice program here at New America. Bridget is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, an Apple Top 50 podcast host, and a highly sought-after keynote speaker, which are just a few of her many accomplishments. And next, we have Molly Martin. Molly is our director of strategy at New America. Molly has an extensive background in organizational learning and for many years has worked with local communities across the Rust Belt on issues of racial and economic equity. I'll let Molly give us a little more context on the Rust Belt later. Before joining the philanthropic sector, Molly was also an award-winning freelance writer. So let's get into our discussion around imagining a better future of work and well-being. Organizations across various industries are currently adapting to a dynamic labor market while simultaneously determining the appropriate path in our hybrid setting. This presents a unique opportunity for us to envision a future of work that values the welfare and nurturing of workers and guarantees access to good work opportunities for all. So let's look at the big picture. It is clear that the future of work is a growing concern for so many. Whether you're a business owner, an employer, an employee, or a policymaker, you may be grappling with a future of work that seems uncertain for a variety of reasons, not the least of which are in the wake of the pandemic and artificial intelligence, along with automation of some jobs. With that in mind, I will start with you, Molly. Will you talk us through the framing of your research around human and worker well-being? And I'll let you give us a little bit more color into your background and what you do here at New America.
Sure. Thank you for having me and welcome everyone. So when I came to New America in 2017, I was charged with something fairly specific, which was to look at automation and its impact on workers. And I'm based in Indianapolis and my work centers on the Midwest or the Rust Belt and reaches all the way out into Buffalo, Pittsburgh, West Virginia, which is where I grew up, and looks at the intersection of race, economy, artificial intelligence, and the future of work. And the research that we did was largely based on lived experience. It was a very journalistic project. It was part of something at New America that we partnered with Bloomberg on called the Shift Commission, looking at what are the trends for the future of work and how can we make that still an accessible and humane moment. One of the things that I learned in doing that work as a person whose background is actually not in technology, is not in futurism, is I learned that the future, while rapidly changing, the definition, the boundaries of work are rapidly changing. One thing is core, and that's the person, right? The family, the person, the individual, and the community. And the things that they need and rely on don't change as much. It's the infrastructure around them. And as we looked at that, we began to talk about the idea of worker well-being. Bridget has done extensive work on this and talking about worker stress. Our colleague at New America, Elizabeth Garlow, does extensive research on the idea of economic well-being. And the idea is that our identities as workers will necessarily change as the number of jobs in total available to us go down and our productivity in those jobs changes. We will need communities to build up and pick up some of the function that has been historically served by employers. Living in the Midwest, right? We all know about things like General Motors, General Electric, big factories, factory towns where people got together, barbecues on weekends. Your building at GE would have a basketball court in the middle of it. Everything was provided and taken care of by your employer. Growing in West Virginia, the entire idea of mining towns is the same. That has gone away. And as employers need to provide different things, and as employers' choices change, there are things that employers may not be able to give to us to sustain our well-being. And so the onus is on employers and communities and workers to be able to come together and to agree to come together to talk about what building a well-being infrastructure looks like. New America's current work is focused on developing new economic indicators for well-being and growth that are not just profit-based, GDP-based. Bridget can talk a little bit more about the sorts of data that we need to start using instead of those kind of historical, short-sighted economic indicators. And the Department of Commerce and New America are actually hard at work with the OECD at figuring out what a definition of economic well-being could include and what those domains would look like.
Awesome. Thank you, Molly. Now, Bridget, as Molly mentioned, you've done extensive research in this area. Please let us just enlighten us on the framing around your research.
Sure. Well, Marla, thanks so much. It's great to be here. And Molly, wonderful to see you. It's wonderful we partner on many of these issues. So it's great to be together talking about this. So at the Better Life Lab, we say that we're the work family justice. We're all about elevating the value of care, paid and unpaid care. And we're about intersectional gender equity. Those things are all very tied together. So when you think about work family justice, you have to look at work and not just the now of work, but the future of work. And so that's sort of, we've been looking at that for quite some time. A lot of what the Better Life Lab does is we do narrative change. We're looking to move public policy, we're looking to move workplace practice, and we're also looking to change cultural attitudes to create the awareness that can then create the demand for different and better policies and better workplace practices. That those three things are very integrally combined. You can't do one without the other. You need to be pressing on all three of those levers at the same time. So one of the reasons when I talk about narrative change, it was one of the reasons that we chose the name Better Life Lab when I first came on in 2015. New America had always had some kind of work family program, tended to be very policy focused. And we wanted to, I kept saying, I want to galactify these issues because for so long they were seen as sort of women's issues or labor issues or poverty issues. And we really wanted to bring a mindset that understood that they were all interconnected. That was really all about family sustaining policy. It was about creating the conditions at work and in policy and in our cultural attitudes and expectations and behaviors that really centered, I think our colleagues at the New Practice Lab use this term so beautifully, human flourishing, that's really what we're all about. And so that led a lot to us deciding to use the words rather than some kind of work family or kind of a more gendered program description, that what we're really talking about is quality of life, economic justice, equity. And so that's where the Better Life Lab comes from, is that it's a lab because we're trying to figure it out because nobody really knows the answers. And so we're experimenting, we're iterating, we're telling stories, we're asking, we're listening. And so a lot of our work, we do original research, we do a lot of our own original reporting and get it out in front of broad and also targeted audiences. And this most recent work that we were doing, it was a really interesting project that combined deep reporting, a 10-episode podcast season with our partners at Slate that really centered human voices and then really looked at the worker and also just the human experience as expertise, that we need to really rethink what an expert is, bringing in scholars and researchers who can help put that story in context, but in dialogue, and asking humans who are closest to the problem, what is it that you need to thrive and to flourish? What are some of your solutions and ideas that we need to be listening to? So you're not just in the ivory tower, from on high saying these are the right answers, so that you're in dialogue and conversation. And so from there, we had a multi-stakeholder convening that led to this report that both Molly and I worked on, looking at how do we map out what is the road to a better, more equitable future of work. And what are some very practical things that policymakers need and can do, that business leaders need and can do, that workers themselves need and can do. And we also looked at what journalists and media and storytellers need and can do. And so we take a very head, hand, heart approach, so the data is the head, the stories are the heart, and the tools are very practical, the sort of the hands, if you will. And so a lot of the most recent work dealt with some of very troubling research that I don't think gets enough attention. And I think sometimes because it seems so big, we just kind of turn off and walk away, but really looking at work stress. And here in the United States, we see that as an individual problem that then requires some kind of individual solution. We tend to think, oh, if you're stressed, it's your fault. You just can't hack it and go take a bubble bath, or, but we're not going to bubble bath our way out of what are really systemic issues around power and equity. And what creates job strain, which then has enormous health consequences, productivity consequences. And really our message, I would say, is very simple across all of our work, is that when you do the right thing for humans and well-being, you're actually doing the right thing for your business, for productivity. So it benefits you for your profits. It's also good for our society, our democracy, and our world.
And Bridget, that's great, because you mentioned the phrase human flourishing. I love that. In the past, the conventional wisdom around business outcomes like productivity and profitability have always been at odds with the well-being of employees. Can you tell us more about these things, and how can they really be working together to deliver better work experiences in pursuit of stronger businesses and organizations? Here at New America, we talk about human-centered politics, but that human flourishing, I love that phrase. Can you just kind of give comment on that in terms of how we can just kind of marry those two between productivity, profitability, and then the well-being of employees?
Sure, I can give a start and then turn it over to Molly, since this is really at the crux of the work that we've been doing together. So I think one of the first things to say is, a lot of it is our mindset and our paradigm of what we believe. And I would say that in the last 40 years in particular, Molly has talked about how communities need to come together as we think about a future of work. Well, at one time we did, after the Second World War, that was called the social contract. There was this sort of agreement that the government through public policy, that businesses through their leadership and the way that they organize their work, and that workers, whether through unions or through organizations, everyone had a role to play to ensure that there was quality of life for workers and that there was good productivity and profitability for business, which then led to a stronger economy, a stronger democracy, and a stronger society. And we've seen that really fray in the last 40 or 50 years. It's really gone. And workers now are really on their own. We don't have good public policy that supports them. When it comes to something like care, which is what we focus on at the Better Life Lab, the United States we're real outliers when you look at other peer competitive economies, not just all countries in the world, but the peer competitive economies. We are far behind in supporting workers with care responsibilities. We are far out of touch in the way we think about work and workers. And for instance, we tend to think of workers, and this is true of financial accounting, it's true when we look at layoffs, we think of workers and labor as a cost. And we need to be efficient. There's sort of like this efficiency mania that started off in the 70s. And there was this sort of sense that, companies are too fat. So we've got to get lean, and we got to, new algorithms came on. And so now we're going to try to really closely try to match demand and supply and cut workers to the bone. And if you do that, which has become sort of dogma, and that's taught in most business, like MBA courses, that's taught labor is a cost, and that the first sign of trouble, you want to cut it. What that's led to are layoffs, or just sort of a cost of doing business is the way we think about it. And what we don't look at are downstream effects, which is, layoffs, seeing business labor as a cost, squeezing it at all, at all possible moments. What that's done, say in retail, it's led to erratic schedules. It's led to try to make a living if you don't know how many hours you're going to work, if you don't know when you're going to work. How are you going to arrange childcare? How are you going to get to the doctor? How are you going to be able to afford your bills when your income is so volatile, when your time is so volatile? So we've created really unlivable lives for a lot of people in the name of efficiency. Well, what ends up happening for a business? You have higher turnover. You have people who feel disconnected from the job, from your purpose, from your company, from your mission. What happens then with work with shoppers? If you've got in the retail space, a shopper comes in and they can't find anybody to help them, and the sweaters aren't folded, and so then they leave. So you can measure on your ledger, okay, I've cut workers, and then your profits go up, and Wall Street loves that kind of short term. It looks good, but in the long run, if you've made enough people angry enough that they don't get good service and they leave, or maybe they'll write a bad review on Yelp, what doesn't count in your books is what researchers call lost future sales. And that's harder to get your head around, but you do long-term damage by losing future customers, by losing future clients, by having high turnover, by having really disempowered, unhappy workers. That there's lots of research out there that shows that when you do center well-being, your productivity goes up. Treating people well actually is a good business proposition.
Thank you, Bridget. I mean, that there's a wealth of discussion in that, but I'm going to pitch to you, Molly. I know your work specifically in economic equity. There's a multitude of tie-ins here. I'd love to hear your thoughts also.
For sure. Thank you, Bridget. Bridget teed it up really well. And I think this applies to looking at the future of work at any level. If you're thinking federally, if you're thinking from a corporate perspective, if you're thinking from a small town perspective, we need better information. And information that is quick and kind of from a single perspective hasn't served us super well. It's very easy to turn on the jobs report every month and think, okay, more jobs, good. Jobs are down, bad. What did a politician do wrong? It's important to ask questions, but that's not really a compelling story. How many more women were in the workforce than used to be? What were the childcare costs for the people who stayed in the workforce that month or rejoined the workforce? There are lots of elements that we need to understand, and lacking a really crisp national data system that tells us all of that, the onus is often on employers to gather better data about the people working for them, not in terms of surveillance, but in terms of the lived experience and needs and asks of those workers to feel valued and feel respected. In terms of economic equity, it's a huge gap. The information gap is really huge because we don't tend to understand or dissect what kinds of jobs were added, how well those jobs pay, the stress and health outcomes associated with some of those jobs. At the end of the day, on paper, maybe there are no bad jobs, but we do know that the jobs that pay least are sometimes physically demanding or sometimes unpredictable in shift or pay, as Bridget noted. Those tend to affect certain groups of people disproportionately. In America right now, especially in the Midwest, we have a huge problem with this. Huge earning gaps and huge opportunity gaps between white and non-white residents, especially for Black and Latina residents here in the Midwest. Huge gap. For women, the gap gets bigger. And so to understand the data about the types of jobs we're adding, about the quality of the jobs we're adding, and even when jobs are, certainly all jobs are honorable, the work is honorable, but some of them you're not meant to stay in forever. And some of them may not be goal jobs, but those still need to be good jobs. And we spend a lot of time in the future of work conversation talking about how to get everyone in to the great jobs at the top. But the thing is, around the time of, even by the 80s, but certainly it just fell completely by about 2008 in conjunction with the Great Recession, you had the great jobs, and you had this stairwell to the great jobs, and those were exceptional, and those were kind of the knowledge economy jobs that we see today. Not as many people had them. You had kind of the ground game jobs that are really important and are honorable, but tend to be perhaps more physically demanding or lower paid. Janitorial, certain retail jobs, certain service jobs, all important. But in the middle, for a long time, especially after World War II, especially in the 60s, you had this boom of great jobs you could get with a high school degree or a high school diploma. That fell apart. Like it's like the stairway between the ground game and these great jobs collapsed. And now there's no way for people to get from here to here. And the way to get through that versus is not about necessarily talking about cutting costs, although it's certainly important to be good stewards. It's talking about what would make people feel a sense of motivation, belonging, longevity, health, ability to grow in that, and the ability to access the assets that let us pursue economic and professional opportunities: childcare, transportation, food security, healthcare. These are the things that we know we need. And I'm frequently talking to small groups here in the Midwest about, well, what do? We opened this factory, nobody showed up. I had a conversation with some folks in Michigan about that, and they'd had a huge addition of multiple thousands of jobs, and they couldn't fill them. And a lot of it was there was no bus stop. And I think that's a simple thing. And gathering information about why no one was showing up, instead of relying on these narratives that come at us kind of quick and dirty from the media that says, well, people don't want to work. That's the interrogation that I think we need to do.
Yeah. No, that's great perspective, because one thing about better information, I know data tells us a lot, right? And so as we have to kind of skew our data again in the light of COVID and the pandemic, and the work and well-being is shifting. We have a question from the audience, and from Suzanne Thompson, Dr. Suzanne Thompson. Can you share thoughts and or advice regarding human flourishing for colleagues or workers who are more physically isolated or stressed with the increase in remote work or remote working spaces? That was a tongue twister. Either one of you want to jump in on that one? How about you, Bridget?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in a little bit. So since a lot of what I've looked at is work stress or psychosocial work stress, really, it's not something that we track here in the United States. It's not something that we have a regulatory regime to help deal with, because again, we still have this kind of very individualistic notion that, if things are going wrong, I mean, look at all the burnout conversation. That tends to be like, well, what can you do? I mean, even if you go on like the Mayo Clinic or OSHA, it's just like, breathe deeply and, talk to your manager about your workload. But what all those psychosocial stress literature shows is that it's really about the structure of the work itself. And it's really about job strain, which is sort of like this difference, kind of like the difference between the amount of effort that you do and the resources and the rewards that you get. And when it's in an imbalance, when you aren't in control, or you feel like it's unjust, or you've got a toxic boss, or you don't have a great schedule, or if it's in conflict with what you need with your care responsibilities or your life, that's when job strain sets in. And there are serious consequences: long work hours, lack of sleep. Even when you don't take paid vacation, the research is now, there's decades of it that shows it leads to higher cardiovascular incidents, obesity, diabetes, higher stress can even lead to cancers. It impacts your family, it impacts your children. So we're in this really, more to your point about what I like to call it digital work, because we're in this kind of space where, there's this tussle between return to office, return to workplace. I used to hate the return to work. It's like, what do you think we've been doing? But this tussle, and what you're seeing, and I've been tracking it through surveys and some of the work that we're doing, is a real disconnect between people in power who set the tone and set the policies. And many of them worked in this kind of work first, ideal worker, always on, come into the office, somebody else is going to take care of the care responsibility. I'm work devoted, so I can put in long work hours. That's the way they were able to work and reach the top, so to speak. So then that's what they think everyone else should do. That's what they're used to. And then they recreate that, and they tend to promote people who work that way. And then you recreate what's really corporate monoculture over and over and over again, which then disadvantages women, disadvantages people with care responsibilities, disadvantages workers of color, disadvantages workers with disabilities. So one of the things that I think has been so interesting and powerful during the pandemic is that, we've had the technology to work digitally. Remote work to me is still sort of that older frame, that real work is done somewhere else. And so you are remote from a place. But digital or networked work, distributed work is what we really started doing for those who could, for desk workers, about 30–40% depends on which survey you look at of the workforce. And I think it's really important that we've done work on how do you improve things for not just digital workers, but hybrid and essential workers. And there are things that companies and policy can do to respond to that. But when you work in that digital setting, there are benefits and there are also disadvantages. So some of the benefits, particularly the research shows for people with care responsibilities, it gives them more control and flexibility to be able to manage work and care. For workers of color, there's research that shows that many of them feel stress has gone down because they are not faced with daily microaggressions, whether intentional or unintentional. They're not faced with sort of code switching. Many have reported that they find that their work product, their performance is front and center and not their identity, which is also a good thing. So and people with disabilities feel like the playing field has been leveled, that other people have been able to work in a distributed fashion, so they're not singled out, that they weren't able to come physically to some place, so somehow they must be a lesser worker. So there's been all sorts of positive benefits from more digital and hybrid work, if you will. On the flip side, you talk about isolation, and there are some downsides to it. And I think that there are a lot of things that we can think about, particularly as organizational leaders, to deal with some of the isolation. Younger workers, they need to learn how to work, sort of cultural osmosis, if you will. There needs to be that sense of connection and mentorship. You can build culture digitally, but it takes intentionality. And a lot of firms, from my research, don't know how or aren't doing it. But there are things that you actually can do. But I would say one other real disadvantage to digital work, and this is also where organizational leaders can come in, it's what people have called the shapeless workday. There are no firm boundaries. I mean, those have been dissolving in recent years anyway. But a lot of times you walk by, your computer and you sit down and you start doing your email and it's 11 o'clock at night. So the boundaries between work life and life have become blurred, which is difficult for many people. And it sort of takes away from that sense of refreshment and frankly, the leisure and rest that we all need, because we're humans and we're not robots. So as organizational leaders, there are things that you can do. Creating, virtual moments, recreating sort of cooler moments, if you will, water cooler moments, taking time out of virtual meetings to make sure that you're connecting, that you're kind of showing your human side, asking people about life, about their well-being, having more. One of the things that's interesting that the research shows that there's been more, like in our one-on-ones, there's been deeper connection in some of the virtual conversation. So leaning into what works. I love the Harvard researcher Celia Neodal. She talks about, if you're going to do hybrid work, be awesome at both. Take but learn the skills. And we've got this toolkit that I'd mentioned that talks about some of those. And I would say that the big takeaway is really being aware, listening to people, creating the spaces to talk. And listening to the solutions that people have, but being really intentional about it, and recognizing that we're all in a sort of a grand experiment and we're figuring it out as we go. So taking that experimental attitude toward it, tracking data, listening to people, creating pilots, experimenting, iterating, and adapting as you go.
Well, that's awesome. Okay, so I have a number of questions. But I'm going to start just a slight, not necessarily a pivot, but I want to lean more into the types of workers. There's also a generational divide in how people view work and their expectations for the work week. What does your research show about how different generations approach work and what can be done to manage multi-generational organizations? Bridget, I'll stay with you, and Molly, I want you to kind of lean in and just kind of organically flow into this question, please.
So I guess when I saw that question, the one thing that I do want to say and have always said over and over again, when you look at sort of longitudinal surveys over time, you know what? There isn't a whole lot of generational difference in terms of what people want. In terms of what people want, they want time. Meaningful work is important to a lot of people's identity. Having, not just life-sustaining work, but meaningful work. But they also want time for life, for care and leisure. The title of my first book, Overwhelmed: Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time, all about time pressure. It really took its title from the Harvard psychologist Erik Erikson, who said that the deepest, richest, and fullest lives make time for the three great arenas of life: work, love, and play. And I guess what I would say is that those are really human desires, and that spans generations. And what the research will show is that every generation wants meaningful work, love, and play. It's just that the older generations got pulled into this corporate monoculture and felt that they had no choice. So soldier on, gonna do it, stick it out. Even if I have a heart attack, I'm doing it. And the younger generations, I think what's different is they don't want to do that. And they are more willing to walk away. We have a whole lot more precarity now than we used to. There used to be, I don't want to call it lifetime employment, but jobs used to be an awful lot more stable and secure, and they're not. And so there's already among younger people kind of a distrust, kind of a cynicism. There was one survey that came out that a number of them would rather move to a different country because they have better family supportive policies. So hello out there, policymakers: paid family leave, investing in childcare, home care is like, these are good things, and we need to be thinking about them as a society. But I think let's not lose sight of the fact that human beings want the same thing, which is a good and meaningful life, and how work fits into their lives, not eats it alive. And there are things that we can do about it as organizational leaders to make sure that there are flexible work policies, that you look at outcomes and performance rather than input and how many hours you spend in the office or online, that there are better metrics, as Molly mentioned, that we can use that actually get you more of what you want, which is productivity and performance, and breaks away from some of those beliefs that are really kind of damaging of typical corporate culture.
Yeah, an interesting thing, and Molly, I'm going to pitch to you, but interesting thing about the pandemic, right, is that I found that pre-pandemic, there was all this talk about, millennials and, the Gen Zs and their work, their views on work and perspectives on what should and should not be done. And I'm finding here in the last year that gap is being narrowed, right? And that there is more, I guess, understanding between generations. Like, it's starting to level out where, there's an appreciation for some of the thought process around having more flexibility, et cetera, because, the whole work-life balance conversation spans, as you stated, Bridget, across generations. So there's not that much divide. But Molly, go ahead. I want to hear from you on this topic as well.
Well, Marley, you teed it up beautifully. I mean, I would agree with everything Bridget said. And I would say we do need to change our perspective on what a generational divide actually means for us, right? The pandemic narrowed a lot of things. The social and political unrest, rise of authoritarianism in the world has segregated folks outside of generational corridors, right? So the other thing to think about, though, is that I'm a Gen Xer, so I was born in the 70s, and we were a small group. I know that there are some of us on the call today, and we were still a really small group population wise. And we were, if you're in my case, I was a child of folks from the 40s. And, my mother, when she went to college, she had to go to the women's college for 2 years before she was allowed to maybe move to the main campus of University of Virginia if she wanted to go into medicine. And so it's not that long ago, right, that our parents were dealing with a picture of work and opportunity that was far more narrowed by war, by the legacy of the Depression and being raised by Depression era parents in their cases. And there were just so few of us. Like Bridget said, we kind of said, okay, call us the slacker generation, but it is what it is. We watched a space shuttle explode in the classroom. Okay, we'll just do it. Now, meanwhile, right, the millennials came up and they were a huge group of people and a huge birth rate, and really changed working norms. There were just so many more of them. And as we know, as the millennials are hitting 40 on the top end, they make up a lot of our day-to-day work. And just like every generation before them, you get to 40 and maybe your perspective and your care opportunities and responsibilities change. So we do become kind of all in it together at some point. But Gen Z is, I think, a really interesting thing to grapple with. They are the most diverse generation, which means we need to think differently about how we define family, how we understand microaggressions, how we understand people's expectations and cynicism about, say, workplace surveillance, or being required to be on camera during a meeting. They're raising some good questions, and they are not a huge group of folks. The early groups of Gen Zers, it's a little bigger, but in 2008, when the recession hit, birth rate started to take an all-time slide, and it remained there. And our other colleagues at New America who work in education policy would remind you that we are seeing a historical college enrollment cliff, the largest dip in college enrollment since the GI Bill came out. And that means all of a sudden, all of these workforce community college pipeline programs that focused on post-secondary education and work in a very specific way are making us sweat a little bit, because there just aren't going to be as many people. And the graduating classes of high schools will be the smallest they have been in generations for 20 years. Starting in 2026. So we have to be ready for the smallest group of high school graduates ever, folks who have a deep cynicism of the way that the world has been moving, folks who have existential dread about the climate, in a way that, while we all might have it, the Gen Z folks know nothing else, right? We have to think about the actual size of our talent pool. And while I do believe absolutely it should be about human flourishing, there's also, if you're having trouble making this argument at the dinner table, there is a numbers argument here that we have to get better at working with non-white folks and folks who were born after 1990, because they are the game. And they will have a lot of leverage. And I think when people ask me, what do we do? I always say, think very, very differently about whether or not your practices target mostly kind of traditional white middle class folks. Raise your wages, and remember that people value respect and fair treatment above almost anything else. And as Bridget and I were doing the American Karoshi Project, and as Bridget was doing her exquisite work on the podcast, that's what people kept bringing up. Wages matter, and wages have been stagnant since the 70s, largely in America, especially in the Midwest. But respect, dignity, not feeling like someone has click monitoring on their screen, not feeling like someone isn't trusted, not feeling like someone's hairstyle is in question. These things really eat away at people's feelings of worth at work. And that is across generations.
Go ahead, Bridget. Go ahead.
If I could just jump in really quickly, I love everything that you just said, Molly. And I've been working on my second book. Basically, it was going to be called Overworked. And then I sold my proposal in March of 2020. And my editor called back in April of 2020 and said, we can't call it Overworked because so many people are unemployed. I'm like, we can't write this book right now because we don't know how work is changing. And so now it's going to be called Overwork. Like, we just can't keep doing it this way anymore. It's just, it's not working. And it's time for a better way to work and live. I completely lost my train of thought there. So yeah, I was
We'll
just
come
gonna,
back to you.
I was gonna build on something you said, Molly, and I will think about it, and I'm gonna put myself on mute until I remember.
Well, I might jog your memory. I'm gonna say a few things and jump in. Feel free to jump in if it pops back up. But Molly, I love what you know, kind of how you've illustrated, if you will, even from a diversity lens, that, you know, with the Gen Zers and this perspective of like a new work environment, I feel in some ways people have really been able to focus on their work and less on, you know, some of the stereotypes and boxes they feel like they've had to fit in, you know, kind of in the traditional sense of going to work. Bridget, you make a very good point. We are not returning to work. We were returning to a space because some of us were working twice as hard as we were without the commute, you know, without the walk around the office. I found even myself that my Zoom meetings didn't even allot for, you know, a 1 or 2 function break. I'll just leave it there. And so, you know, you're kind of going off camera and taking a bite and you're trying to figure out all the things. And so in some cases there was some relief, right, when we returned back to offices. But then, you know, it was like, okay, well, let's look at a hybrid model, because we did enjoy having kind of that space and not having to fit into a box and recreating ourselves. I saw a lot of people recreate themselves in every industry. You watch the news and, you know, you see different things. People looked different and they were kind of, you know, they were more free and they were more, you know, flowing in their own space. And Bridget, you said you remembered what you had to say. So I'll let you chime in here, but I think there's a lot to, you know, think about when it comes to you know, the multi-generational / diversity / new work era. Go ahead, Bridget.
Thank you so much. It's so funny. I just was all of these ideas are just like crashing around in my head because, you know, I do this at the Better Life Lab. I've got like, I'm on deadline and my book's almost done. But what I was going to say, and thank you for giving me some grace there, everybody, for being a little overwhelmed. You know, but what I was going to say is, I read this really interesting book by a Dutch historian named Jan Lucassen. It's called The Story of Work. And it's basically a history of work. And a couple things that I love about it that I wanted to share that I think are very to the point of what we're talking about today, and particularly with the work I do on care and gender equity. And one of the things I'm arguing in the book that he argues is that we need to really rethink the way we think about work, that it's not just what we do for pay in the marketplace. That is paid work. That's what we measure with GDP. That's what we sort of value. And there's all sorts of issues with that we've been talking about. But we also need to think about work and expand that's also the unpaid work of care and home that women have traditionally been expected to do. And that is invisible and undervalued. And that's a lot of what has, because of the expectation that that's what women do, that's seen as sort of a burden and a care responsibility, even though that's some of the most joyful thing that you could do in your life. And we need to be thinking broadly that work is both what we do for pay in the market and the unpaid work of care and home. And that as human beings, we are all wired to do both. That there is no reason why men should or are the breadwinners in the public sphere of paid work, and that women are or should be the unpaid caregivers at home. And one of the things that we did at the Better Life Lab was a really large study about men and care and their experiences and attitudes. And we found that men overwhelmingly support and want to give care. They want to do it equally with their partners, but they feel they can't because of our workplace cultures, because of our lack of public policy, and because of the stigma that they receive. That also impacts men in paid care work. That's why you don't see men going into nursing as much or home care work. And it's one of the reasons why the care jobs that Molly had talked about earlier they are also invisible and undervalued. These are all things that we need to be thinking about in the now and future of work. But what I loved about Jan Lucassen is not only broadening our idea of how we define work, but that he said that throughout history, two things. We have, as human beings, we have organized work in an infinite number of ways. There is no one right way to do it. So we can, and it's all about what we choose. It's what we believe and what we choose. So we have the power to make different choices, number one. And number two is that all good work throughout human history in both paid and unpaid spheres, they've been defined by three main principles: fairness, cooperation, and meaning. And so I think that if you remember that and you can bring that in as a policymaker, as an organizational leader, or even in your own life, those are principles that I think are guiding principles for all of us.
No, that's awesome. So on that point, Bridget, tell us more about your toolkit, because we're going to share this with our attendees today during this discussion. But tell us more about how this toolkit can be useful in multiple environments. We have folks from different sectors of work joining us today, and I'm sure they can walk away with a tool that they can take back to their teams and share.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this is actually at the Better Life Lab, we have an advisory council, which is incredibly helpful. And we have quarterly workshops, which are great. They're virtual now. So now everybody can join, whereas it was difficult to get everybody in a physical location before. And so we have some organizational leaders from the corporate world, from research. It's a really good group of people. And it's a great way for us to hear from people, like what are their pain points, how can they inform our work. And this came as a direct request from our advisory council. It's like, we don't know what to do, digital, remote, work at home, hybrid, essential, we don't know what to do. Can you go and find the best research that tells us, like, what are some tools that we can use, what are some guidelines? So that's what we did. And so we did a broad scan of the research that's out there. And so the toolkit really looked not so much at sectors, but at types of work, because what we were hearing from our advisory council is that people were struggling with, how do I do digital work well? They were struggling with, like, how do I do hybrid work well? And some were struggling with, how do we do essential work well? We clap for essential workers and then we forget about them. What do they really need? And so the toolkit is set to address those three different types of work. And then there are three case studies of each. And I guess what I would say, a takeaway is that there is sort of a best practice, if you will, that came up over and over again with the most successful companies who were able to either pivot to digital or pivot to hybrid, or were able to really make better work environments for essential workers. And it comes down to those three principles again, fairness, cooperation, and meaning. And so sort of the secret sauce is, as a leader, you have to believe that change is possible, and you set the tone. And then you give power and autonomy to teams, and you figure out, okay, this is the what of your work. How do you do it better? How would you organize it? What are your pain points? And you turn it over to them, and they talk amongst themselves, and you listen. So you give power close to where the work gets done. And then you come back, and together you design a policy or a plan. And it's the same thing. You pilot it, you experiment, you gather data, and then you come back and you iterate and you adapt. And that works in all three of those types of environments. But leadership is key. Because one thing I can tell you over and over again, and that's one of the things that's sort of dangerous about this sort of tussle that we've seen with this hybrid or digital and return to office. What that shows me is that there's leaders who don't believe that there's change, that change is possible, or that changing the way we work is going to be beneficial. And the data is not in their favor. The data, Nick Bloom out of Stanford, Slack's Future Forum, they've done quarterly pulse surveys over and over and over again. The data shows that if you give workers autonomy and power, if you focus on fairness, meaning, and cooperation, if you look at human well-being, you're going to get the performance you want, you're going to get the productivity you want, and you'll actually do better as a business.
So that's interesting, because I'm curious, do you have, or you or Molly have any examples of companies or organizations that have implemented policies to promote worker well-being and good work, like some of those companies that are winning in this space? Either one of you. Molly, I'll to you. I haven't heard your
Yeah.
voice in a minute. So
I know,
I'll
I was
start with you,
glad
Molly,
you
and
got-
then
Oh,
Bridget.
sure.
I'll come back to you because I want to hear your perspective. And thank you for sharing the components of that toolkit. I think a lot of people will find that extraordinarily useful.
Sure, this is a good question. I mean, I have been lucky to meet so many different kinds of employers across the country, and I see lots of people making really good decisions. I'll give a couple examples. New America has a vast body of work on youth apprenticeship, paid, modern, stackable, leading to the next job or the next educational opportunity, youth apprenticeship. And we should be very proud of it. I am very proud of my colleagues. And in meeting the employers who participate in the youth apprenticeship ecosystem building, the policies and sort of handshake agreements that they have made to not hoard employees is exceptional, because we know it's really hard to find new people. But I would look to a community like Buffalo or Rochester. I would look to Western New York and say there are places where companies like 3M and other kind of mammoth manufacturers, like take the food distributors out there, Wegmans, who have gotten together and said, we're going to get together and create an education and earning pipeline that especially seeks to close equity gaps, especially seeks to get non-white people into really terrific pathways. And we're not going to hold on to them with a death grip. We're going to make a pathway for them to move between 3M and other manufacturers, between Wegmans and other kind of food and lifestyle curation brands, across different banks like M&T. That's a great move. And that's a great move for a small company or a giant company to understand that to build your ecosystem and your sector and your industry is actually really smart for you. And the best way to build it is to make sure that people feel kind of fulfilled, cared for, empowered to make the moves that are right for them. And if they have a good experience with you, them moving to 3M is not going to sink you, because as you know, most of America kind of lives in the ex-urban areas, right? We know lots of people live in urban centers. We do know that rural populations get overlooked, but the folks in between, that's the lion's share of America. And so these medium markets are where you see employers building the culture that is letting people say, you know, this is a good place to live because these people are good employers. I did quite a bit of work in Bentonville, Arkansas. I had a good experience working with Walmart's efforts to build their community. And I think that's important to look at a place like Arkansas and look at a place, you know, a town of 55,000 people and recognize that you also need to move with the demographic times. And I think Walmart, I appreciate their public work to create work pathways for non-white and non-US born neighbors. That's been great. I look at Target and really appreciate the culture building that Target has done. We interviewed several Target employees for a Worker Voices project that New America California led, and some people from Bridget's team were involved in. And that taught me that Target was conveying to their employees that they could show up as themselves, that there would be fair access, that the wages would be relatively competitive, and they appreciated that Target was a presence in their community. People noticed that. And I think, just as my final word, I grew up in a town dominated by a mammoth chemical company. And I cannot begrudge them. They're long gone. But when they pulled up stakes, I don't think they were terrifically thoughtful about the cultural impact that they provided to the capital of West Virginia. And what was a 90,000 person town is now 40. And it's an entirely different place than it was when I was growing up. I'm not saying they had to stay, but I'm saying that they had a responsibility to the transition. If I were king, I would have done it differently.
I love that. Now, in respect of our time, I want to get one more audience question in. This is from Amy Beeden-Pop. Can you speak to ageism in the workplace and any cultural attitude work being done on valuing older persons' contribution in the work environment? So can you, Molly and Bridget, just kind of give us a brief comment on that or some feedback, please?
I'm going to say one sentence and then let Bridget take it on home.
Awesome.
My one sentence is lateral mentoring. If you read The Guardian, it was in The Guardian this week. pairing Gen Z workers who are the newest to the workplace to some of your older Gen Xers or folks closer to retirement, but doing it laterally, treating mentorship as not age-based, not to minimize or diminish an older worker's experience, but to make sure that they have relationships where they have advocates in the up-and-comers. Bridget?
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
love that. And that latter mentoring also, what that can do is, maybe there is more technological savvy in the younger generation. And just as they can help, sort of mentor older workers, just like older workers then can mentor them about, time management or getting work done or how cultures work. So there's a lot of information exchange that can go both ways. And I guess, in terms of any worker of any age, I go back to sort of those basic principles, which is, I think, again, we're in this huge transition period where for too long we focused on sort of an old factory model of focusing on input, hours worked, punching, kind of that punching the clock mentality. And what we really need to shift to is focusing on output and deliverables and performance. And when you do that, then sort of the who you are becomes less important than the what that you do. And we support the outcomes. And so then that way, that's a great way for all workers to flourish and thrive.
Beautifully stated by you both. Thank you. And unfortunately, we've come at our time to close out today's program. I know that we could probably continue on for another hour or so, but we've got to let folks get back to their jobs, right, in their workplace. I want to thank you both for such a thoughtful discussion and for sharing critical information that will help us begin to think through how we move forward in shaping the future of work. I must say, despite some uncertainty, it's reassuring to acknowledge the genuine potential for significant innovation that can place equity at the heart of the future of work. It's wonderful. I cannot stress, it is wonderful to showcase these motivating examples that can serve as a source of learning for others. So what's next? A slide will pop up now, and we here at New America would like to build a sense of community with this series of discussion. So please think about taking some of these ideas back to your internal teams and start the discussion. We will be sharing resources mentioned in today's meeting and hope you will find them useful in your ongoing pursuit of well-being and balance. Also, please join us for the next topic in this series on June 14th, where we will explore the link between climate change and housing loss in the United States. Be on the lookout for that invite. And last, but certainly not least, we would love to hear from you. Please let us know your thoughts on today's discussion and how we can help you learn more about our work here at New America. Thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.